Right, so back to our BRICS coverage. We are taking you live to our Sandton Convention Centre, of course, where SABC News anchor Mfundo Mabelane is standing by with the latest. Once again, Mfundo, we're obviously wrapping things up as the BRICS Summit comes to an end. Perhaps you can bring us the latest then on your end as things stand.
Indeed, Liesl, we are wrapping up. We're now trying to just unpack the declarations. We're joined by Gustavo de Carvalho. He's an analyst specifically focused on Russia-Africa relations. Gustavo, good afternoon. Thank you for joining us.
Good afternoon.
Quite a lot has been said. Perhaps to start with the UN Secretary General's statement, very profound one, when he says multipolarity without transformed multilateral institutions will not lead to peace. What did you make of that statement?
I think it's a very important statement when we look into the facts that multipolarity to a certain degree has already been happening for a number of decades. And to a large degree, I think there is a risk that we deal with a changed global order without necessarily changing the institutions. I think partially what BRICS has been wanting to do is not only to change the global order, but to ensure that their voice is better heard, particularly through the creation of institutions like BRICS. They're not necessarily an either or in terms of other institutions, but really that help us to influence decision-making globally, that makes sure that decisions that are made are impacting the developing world in a more positive manner and supports in terms of sustainable development.
He also talked about the debt burden, that the promises of globalization have not been fulfilled, because if we just look on the continent, a number of nations have this debt that they must service. When they look at their budget, a great amount of that budget is going to servicing debt. They're not developing at the pace they could be developing at. What did you make of that?
One of the challenges we've been seeing, and particularly in the context of BRICS, is the frustration that countries have in terms of the lack of control, in terms of which currencies they can trade with. What is their own ability of getting loans within lower interest rates? Partially, I think, and of course, it's a very difficult process. I don't necessarily think that we are replacing other currencies here, but I think what countries are looking to do is to find a space within a macroeconomic environment where it becomes more stable for them, that enables them to better integrate and interact with one another without necessarily at all times requiring to use different currencies. At this particular stage, I think there is the potential also of the New Development Bank. And of course, the New Development Bank is not necessarily the cheapest when it comes to the levels of their interest rates, but it is an important opportunity for the future where it can enable members to get financing for very important infrastructure and investments for these countries, and particularly when they're starting to deal more with one another.
And then to the other big announcement, the expansion. 6 more nations will now be joining BRICS. What did you make of that announcement?
It's an interesting decision, certainly a bit controversial regarding some of the countries. A lot of countries showing concerns about Iran in particular. I think, but in particular, I think what does provide its members and what we have seen is an increase of liquidity within the group. We have countries that are very large producers of oil,
such as
Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and even Iran for that matter. But also to a certain degree, it was very clear that some of the BRICS members were really looking for bringing countries from their own regions. We saw South Africa going very strongly about the importance of bringing new members, and I think it was an important success for the country that we now have 2 new African countries within BRICS, Ethiopia and Egypt. When it comes to Brazil, a country that was a bit concerned and a bit skeptical about the expansion until yesterday afternoon.
But they had always been pushing for the likes of Argentina, which, if we had to be more granular, right now is dealing with its own crisis, even the debt burden. And they had actually been invited at the 2022 virtual sitting, where they went on to state that they are looking to be part of alternative blocs because the world order has not necessarily benefited the majority. But many still felt it was quite interesting to bring in an Argentina. What was your view on that?
Indeed, and Argentina is going through quite a difficult political process, economic and political. The country is in the middle of an electoral campaign right now. There is a chance that either the far right or the center right may win those elections, and that would mean a slight changes in relations with Brazil in particular and with the rest of the region. This is part of some of the concerns in South America in terms of what will happen in the future, but also noting that the foreign policies of countries like Brazil and Argentina tends to be very intertwined intertwined, especially since the 1980s, where I think at some point the countries acknowledge that they're rivals in many ways, but they also understand that they cannot really move forward without one another.
You touched on concerns around Iran. Just take us through or expand on just that which you found that many were now concerned about. What exactly is the problem with Iran joining this bloc?
For many, it has a lot to do, and particularly for the United States, after they have left the Iranian nuclear deal of a few years ago, sanctions have been reinstated, and also in terms of the very fragile relations that Iran has with Western countries. For Russia in particular, the presence of Iran is of extreme importance. Russia is looking for diversifying the economic relations now that the doors for Europe and the Western world has been closed to them, and especially when they are now building this north-south corridor between Russia and Iran that will give access for Russian products, direct access to the Persian Gulf, making it much faster for the exports to come to Africa or Asia. So to a certain degree, I think it wasn't consensual from the beginning. Even within BRICS members, there were concerns that were raised within many of those discussions, but certainly the influence from Russia in that degree and the very important bilateral relations they have with Iran ended up prevailing.
So from what I'm gathering from you, the greatest concern would come from an America that has imposed the sanctions. But if we look at the sanctions themselves, in this instance, what it has done is brought Iran closer to a China, because when their economy was being crippled, China came to the rescue. They've been sending most of their oil to China at discounted prices. You've also got a Saudi Arabia now that has become quite close to an Iran because the peace has been brokered there by China. So would you say economic sanctions have been effective, or the attempt to isolate a nation ends up seeing that nation being viewed as a martyr in certain quarters, and then many come or draw closer to it to assist?
I think particularly with the war in Ukraine, that created a new reflection that before it used to be very specific to countries like Iran or Zimbabwe or even Venezuela for that matter. Right now, I think with the sanctions that were imposed in Russia, unprecedented sanctions that were done, freezing assets in terms of the reserves of Russia, to a large degree, I think what many countries in the global south have perceived is that there is a hyper-politicization of the US dollar, something that many would see as a global economic good in terms of the ability of trading, the ability of engaging with the US dollar has been particularly important. So what developing countries right now would be pursuing is to find alternatives for that, is to identify that they don't want to be entirely isolated in a global order and they want to engage with other countries. It doesn't mean that all of the countries will have the same positions about everything. One thing about BRICS that is quite interesting is that members often agree to disagree. We know that their positions are not always the same on everything. There are still concerns about the relationship of Iran and Saudi Arabia. Despite the brokered deal by China earlier this year, there is a very deep and historical tension that we have between the two countries, what we call this Middle Eastern Cold War. But we shouldn't forget there is also tension in other parts of BRICS as well with the incoming countries, Egypt and Ethiopia,
yes.
Argentina and Iran. Next year when the two countries are going to be joining.
And perhaps this is an opportunity to see how they broke a peace as a bloc for these particular nations.
It would be very interesting to see whether BRICS is going to start utilizing its own structures as a means to build confidence between the members of BRICS. So when we look into the role that China played with Saudi Arabia and Iran, but the roles that South Africa has been playing with Ethiopia and Egypt when it comes to the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, hopefully there could be a space that can bring it inside BRICS and especially becoming brokering some of those challenges that we have in certain regions and strengthening the capacity of the bloc of engaging with the very specific issues that the bloc deals with when it comes to the reform of international financial institutions, of increasing their voice in multilateral spaces. And it's not going to mean that they're going to always agree on everything. I think as we've seen this week, there's a lot of these agreements, but this work towards consensus, this work towards identifying what is our minimum common denominator within the bloc, I think are particularly important and potentially a good space for dialogue.
Gustavo, thank you very much for your insights as always. That is analyst Gustavo de Carvalho. Liesel, it's back to you in studio.